Yo guys, what is up? Moxie here in a Borderlands 3 video, and today we are finally bringing you guys my updated Ricochet / Bullet Witch build. My personal favorite build of mine that I've made, and my personal favorite build to use. This build is my baby, and it took me extra long to make sure that the skill points were exactly right for you guys. So really happy to share that with you guys. I'm going to be putting up the skill tree for Ricochet Witch right now, and the skill tree for Bullet Witch shortly after. And while you guys are looking at that, if you could do me a huge favor and check and see if you are subscribed, look at that subscribe button. We are so close to 50k subscribers, which would be an absolutely crazy landmark and goal of mine, and over half of my viewers aren't subscribed. So if you want to do me a huge favor, as I'm showing the skill trees off for you guys right now, and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, really does help me out, guys. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. And with that, let's get into the overall mechanics of this build first, because there are some mechanics that I get asked about all the time. A lot of you guys probably may know these things, but just a quick refresh update course on things that we're using. So the main mechanic here is that when we shoot our weapons, and the weapons we use with this build, for each element that we're hitting an element with, or each element that we're hitting an enemy with, the damages are instanced differently. So these weapons create projectiles and ricochets off of our initial damage, and the more different elements that we're hitting an enemy with, the more projectiles will spawn off of the ricochet, increasing our damage. So the more elements we can do on our weapon, the more damage we can get out. And there's a little caveat to that I'll explain in a second. But more elements, more damage. The next thing that we need to talk about is the driver class mod and why it's so good, and how we're using it. So the driver class mod, whenever we use our action skill, we apply our action skill element to ourself. Now, this does a few things, but the reason we're using Phase Grass so much is because it is an easy, no cooldown way to apply a dot to ourself. Now, when we are dotted and using this with an elemental projector, while suffering an elemental effect, increase your damage with that same element, we are going to be increasing the damage that we do with the dots on us by 90%. Super important for this. But in addition to that, we're also using mindfulness. So whenever we take damage, we get a stack of mindfulness. For each stack of mindfulness, Amara gains improved shield regeneration, delay, and movement speed. When we're moving, we get gun damage, and the quicker we move, the greater the gun damage. So we're able to proc a dot on ourselves, which triggers mindfulness, and that mindfulness will give us movement speed, and that movement speed gives us damage. Super, super cool. Next, I need to answer the most asked question I get is, hey, Moxie, I only get 15 stacks. How are you getting 25? In order to use 25 stacks of mindfulness and the shock element with the transformer, you need a anointed transformer for bonus elemental damage. It is non-negotiable. In order to use shock, you do not need to use shock. Any other element, you don't need an anointed transformer, but if you have an anointed transformer, you can use shock, which is super helpful because the shock dot on ourselves will recharge our shield. So that is a very, very nice tactic to have. With that, let's get into the skill tree and the decisions that we made. So the biggest decision here, after trying a lot of things, was just to grab Guardian Angel. This build performs really, really well, but for some people, it can be frustrating to use. It is a build that takes a little bit of practice getting used to the movement speed and using that movement speed to get our damage. So with Guardian Angel, even if you mess up, if you make a mistake, you get right back up, and it just adds to the unkillable absurdity of this build that even if they finally do get you, you're right back up. Guardian Angel is an awesome skill, and it's what I decided to go with for Ricochet Witch, and I'll explain why the builds are slightly different. Another big thing that we're getting with this build is Arms Deal, because our recursion does splash damage, and boosting our splash damage is always going to be good. Helping Hands, Mindfulness, Root to Rise, Personal Space, all things that synergize really, really well. With this, I'm trying to keep this shorter, so I'm not going to go into in-depth on everything. Fast Hands is really, really nice. Our only healing is from our elemental weapons, so when we're not reloading, or while we're reloading, we are vulnerable, and having Fast Hands to swap between weapons, reload, just increases our survivability, and in turn increases our DPS, especially in fights against Wotan. This tree has changed a little bit, so we're keeping Steady Hands and Wildfire just to get down to these points. You cannot use Infusion with this build, and this was one of the things that was causing the delay of this video, is because I learned something new about Infusion. We weren't using Infusion before, and you do have to use Infusion for the Ricochet or the Bullet Witch build. Once again, I'll get to that in a second, but no Infusion on Ricochet Witch with the recursion because it kills your overkill damage. I'm gonna have a whole video out on this, so if this is confusing to you, I'll have a whole video out shortly breaking it all down. But with Infusion, your damage is instanced into two separate sources. With 5 out of 5, you're going to get one damage source at 60% of your weapon damage, and one instance of your damage at 40% weapon damage. When you hit an enemy with overkill, if the 60% of your weapon damage is enough to kill the enemy, the 40% is not impacted or does not calculated into your overkill. It is void damage, and so you don't rank up your overkill as quickly when you're using Infusion. Now the recursion is super, super great at using overkill damage, because when you overkill an enemy with the projectile recursion, none of the generated projectiles lose the overkill. So if you have full overkill on your recursion and you shoot, all the enemies in the surrounding area will take full overkill damage from it. Once again, if this is confusing, do not worry about it. I will have a video out explaining it all shortly. But for this video, I can't go as in-depth because we try to keep it on the shorter side. So just know, for overkill damage, Infusion is not good, and overkill damage on the recursion is very good. Tempest for more elemental damage plus shock damage. This 50% shock damage is one of the reasons why I always prefer to use shock as my main element on my weapon. Next, Dread. When we do grasp an enemy, we're going to get gun damage. Deep Well for more magazine size. Indiscriminate for that ricochet chance. Our bullets are already ricocheting. This just makes it even crazier. Next up, we have a source of contention for me. We have Sustainment and Conflux. Now, Forceful Expression is a great get. Always grab Forceful Expression here. How you spend these points here is up to you. Now, Conflux is a powerful skill that Amara can use. If you don't know this already, when we proc a dot with Driver on ourself, we have a chance to apply a Electrocute, Ignite, or Melt chance on ourself because we're dotting ourself. If we have, for example, a Shock dot on ourself and a Fire dot on ourself, we are going to be increasing our elemental damage with Fire and Shock by 90%. So the more dots we can have on ourselves, the crazier the damage gets. However, Conflux is a damaging skill on ourselves and can bring you down. That is part of the reason why we have Guardian Angel here. Because if you do go down, you are right back up. I have found no issues surviving with Conflux with my current setup, but when I switched it around and moved some things around, I was noticing the Conflux dot was doing some damage to me. We don't need any more points in sustainment because we hit so hard that sustainment will always get us to full life. But if you are feeling squishy with this build and you're dying, feel free to take out these points from Conflux. They are more damage. They're definitely more damage. I think it's worth going. But if you're getting frustrated and you're dying to your own dot, spec out of it and go sustainment. You will be just fine. So that is the Ricochet Witch build. And now we're going to talk about Bullet Witch and why it's slightly different. The biggest reason for the difference is because you do have to use Infusion on Bullet Witch if you're using a Carrier Assault Rifle. The Carrier Assault Rifle absolutely destroys enemies, but I wanted to make this into one build, and when you go Infusion with the Carrier, it makes a world of difference. I couldn't one-clip Trant without Infusion, and so I really do recommend going Infusion on this. If you want to go Infusion on Ricochet Witch, that's fine. I'm sorry for the confusion here, but it's not as good. So I personally like going Infusion with the Carrier because it kind of sucks with Amara using an elemental weapon with not taking a percentage of its damage and making it elemental, because you're going to get huge payoffs and benefits from that. So Infusion there, pretty much the same skill tree here. I go 5 here in Conflux, and then I put, instead of going Fast Hands and Reload Speed, I go Violent Tapestry because with this standardized Carrier, you're going to want to go as many elements as you possibly can, versus the Recursion is slightly different. I'll explain that in a second. And then no Arms Deal, and we're going Clarity here because with Clarity and more points in one with Nature, this build is less tanky than Ricochet Witch, solely because when you're using a Carrier, you don't get lifesteal from it. So if you want to heal up, you have to use your Phase Grasp. Going Clarity gives you passive health regen, which is awesome, and more health and elemental damage reduction to our Conflux dots is always great. So that is what I go there. Now, let's talk about the weapons real quick and some changes that I've made to them. So I was previously always rocking a Recursion with 100 ASE weapon damage, and I still like that, but I haven't gotten a good level 53 Recursion, and I was noticing I was one-shotting enemies, or one-shotting the bosses when Wotan splits, the Kraken, Valkyries. I was noticing I was one-shotting them more often with the extra element than I was with the weapon damage. At the moment, I've been enjoying a plus 50% spooling projectile recursion. The ×2 is really nice. Make sure you get a ×2 recursion because it'll just double your DPS because it spawns more projectiles. But either is fine at the moment. Like I said, I do like this bonus radiation damage. Radiation has become quickly one of my favorite elements to use on this build because it also increases our clear speed when enemies are bunched up. They're going to be ricocheting and exploding, so that's super sick. With the carrier that I've been using, I switched from shock to radiation damage. Now, the radiation damage on the carrier is going to allow me to use shock as my element, give me radiation, and then for basically my my shield setup, depending on what I'm going, is I'll be using like corrosive and incendiary, and then shock as my action skill. So shock on my action skill, radiation bonus weapons, and then corrosive and fire. You want to not be overlapping for the most part, but you want to be, when you are using a weapon that is elemental, you want to be matching. So for example, with this Rowan's Call, I would be using fire as my action skill element, and I would switch this fire out for radiation because I wouldn't be doing it anymore. For example, with this carrier, I would use shock, and then I would have corrosive and incendiary. For this recursion, I would be using shock because I'd be using the shock form of it with radiation damage and corrosive and incendiary. The reason you want to have corrosive, incendiary, and shock pretty much on every setup is because of conflicts cannot proc radiation or crowd damage on yourself. So the only three things that it can boost are those three elements. It's really important that you have those three. But radiation, having that adds free radiation damage and adds an extra element and adds more projectiles. So at the moment, I really do strongly recommend that. For boss killing, for a lot of people have been like, hey Maxi, I can't kill Grave Ward with your build. And that's why I'm introducing you to the Conference Call. Now, the Conference Call is an absolutely awesome weapon. This dropped from me from Wotan yesterday, which was so hype because I was farming a Conference Call from Judge Hightower for like 3 hours and I never got one, and then Wotan dropped me this. But the Conference Call and all call weapons, if there's a call in the title of the weapon, it's good for this build. Same with the Rowan's Call, King's Call, Queen's Call. The Hyper Focus is also great for this build. Not as good, but it does Ricochet. There's a lot of things. I would be including them in the save file, but the Conference Call and pretty much any weapon that has the word call in it will be great for this build. The Conference Call in particular is great against Grave Ward and Tyreen and Wotan. If you're getting sick of using the Cutsman, I recommend using a Conference Call. With the ricochets that you can create, which is a lot, and overlapping hitboxes, the Conference Call can do a lot of damage and has quickly become one of my favorite weapons to kill Grave Ward with on Amara. I do recommend you giving it a go. Things like the Rowan's Call, Lucian's Call, Wagon Wheel. There's a lot of weapons that you can use that exploit this projectile bug, and they are very, very strong with this setup, whether using them on Ricochet Witch or Bullet Witch. And the last thing I have to say is make this build work for you. What I'm outlining here is what I like using. If there's something that doesn't work for you, if you don't get radiation on your weapon, just switch up your elements. If you have a shock carrier or a cryo carrier, just switch it up. It doesn't need to be exactly what I'm using, because that's impossible to have happen unless you're downloading the save file. But genuinely, as long as you have different elements and you're using different elements, you're hitting things with different elements, this build will perform. Whether you're using Ricochet Witch or Bullet Witch, they are very similar. And you can still use the carrier on Ricochet Witch. Just for boss killing, the carrier does not perform nearly as well without infusion. So that is it for the video, guys. I know it's a little bit complicated. I want to include both of these builds in the same video to just make your guys' life easier. But if you didn't like that, make sure to let me know if it's too confusing. I hope you guys enjoyed. If there are things that you're still unsure about and confused about, make sure to check out the original videos for these builds because I go into way more depth there. But really do appreciate you guys watching. If you enjoyed, learned something new, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, guys. We have so much more on the way for you, and hope you guys have a good one. Peace!